Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches The Great Gatsby. In this video, we're going to be doing a full analysis of chapter 6, focusing on character, theme, language structure and form as always. This is a pivotal chapter where we actually learn a lot more about Jay Gatsby's past and his motivations. So let's get started. So let's have a quick look at a plot summary for chapter 6. The chapter begins with a knock on the door from a reporter who's essentially just looking for a little bit of information about Gatsby. He's trying to find a story, although he doesn't have anything in particular. But this leads Nick to think about how the original Jay Gatsby, a young man known as James Gatz, would feel about this kind of notoriety in his adult life. And we finally get a little bit of the truth about who Jay Gatsby used to be. Now, in this story of the past, where we learn about James Gatz, we learn about his impoverished background and how one particular day, seeing a chap called Dan Cody get into trouble on a boat, he finds an opportunity to go and help him, meaning that Dan Cody takes him under his wing and James Gatz becomes very quickly Jay Gatsby. And after 5 years of sailing around with Dan Cody, looking after him, sort of being his skipper, but also being his friend, sometimes even being his jailer, quote from the text, when Dan Cody has had too much to drink, Jay Gatsby sort of grows up with the manners and the background of someone with new money and quite a lot of wealth. But unfortunately, when Dan Cody dies, Jay Gatsby is left without any money. Any inheritance that Dan Cody had wanted to go to him, unfortunately, goes to one of the women in his life. And so Jay Gatsby is left without much to him. This then catapults Nick back into the present. We don't learn at this moment how he goes from this point of poverty with Dan Cody to the Jay Gatsby we know from the novel. Instead, Nick tells us a story about how whilst he's round at Gatsby's house, Tom Buchanan and a couple of friends come by on horseback by chance and stop in for a drink, and they have this rather kind of uncomfortable exchange about whether or not they're going to join each other for dinner. And this moment stays with Tom Buchanan. Tom finds him an unusual figure and so decides that he's going to accompany Daisy to one of these parties. And so both Tom and Daisy are together at this party, but quite separate, but it certainly gives Tom more of an idea of who Gatsby is. It raises his suspicions somewhat, and Daisy obviously has an opportunity to be with Gatsby. But perhaps what's more important is the fact that Gatsby, just as in the previous chapter, how he reevaluated everything in his house according to Daisy's eyes, the same thing happens now, and he finds her disapproval of his party quite difficult. And then the chapter ends with another sequence of flashbacks, taking us back to a moment in Gatsby's past where he had to sort of make a decision about who he was going to be. But we'll look at that in a little bit more detail later on. So for now, let's get started by having a look at the man, James Gatz. This is Jay Gatsby's younger self, so what he was christened. So the first thing that we find out about James Gatz is that he was very, very poor. His parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. Note the kind of sense of judgment here, which is extended when he talks about the fact that his imagination had never really accepted them as parents at all. He viewed himself as something more, as something potentially better. And then we get this little section here, which is quite complex. He says, the truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God. So this is about young Gatsby, or Gatz's, kind of sense of grandeur. He always felt that there was more to him than the life that he was born into, to the point where he sees himself as the Son of God, a Jesus Christ-like figure. Now, we've got to remember as well that this is being told to us through the lens of Nick, but we are assuming that this is a conversation that he and Gatsby have had that Nick is reporting. Now, you might find this bit a little bit tricky, that J. Gatsby sprang from his Platonic conception of self. This is an allusion to the philosopher Plato, and particularly to an allegory, a metaphor of Plato's cave. And really what it's getting at is this idea of the truest form of self. The Platonic conception of himself is the ideal form. So his dreams of J. Gatsby are what he, as James Gatz, perceives to be the truest, best version of himself, a version that he aligns with being the Son of God. Now that all sounds quite marvellous, doesn't it? But look at how this metaphor is continued and extended. Nick talks about how Gatsby must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, meretricious beauty. Now, his father's business is obviously referring to God. If he's Jesus, the Son of God, his father is God. And this idea, if you think about what Jesus was doing on earth, what his father's business was, it was about spreading gospel, wasn't it? It was about spreading the word. But in this case, what is the gospel of Gatsby? Now, according to this little triad of adjectives here, it's the service of a vast, so huge, vulgar and meretricious beauty. So vulgar is about the kind of, I suppose, the lack of class. Maybe this is to do with the way that he got his money, not just the fact that it's new money, which is considered sort of more brash in comparison to people like Tom Buchanan, although there's irony in that. Meretricious, that adjective, that means when something looks attractive, but there's really not much to it. So this is like an inversion of God's gospel, because the only gospel that Gatsby is selling is essentially one of falsity, something that looks very beautiful, but actually hasn't got any substance to it. And then the last part of this, so he invented just the sort of J. Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent. And to this conception, he was faithful to the end. So again, that sort of undermines the concept of what the true self is. There's a sense of grandeur. He views himself as the ideal form and the Son of God. But actually, these ideas are just the fantasies of a 17-year-old. And J. Gatsby, as he's got older, hasn't grown out of them. We're reminded again of his poverty when it talks about his youth, that he spent a year beating his way along the south shore of Lake Superior as a clam digger and a salmon fisher, or in any other capacity that brought him food and bed. Now, this is how he ended up getting involved in Dan Cody, because of his work out there, being able to see what, it was by chance. But again, it tells us something about the poverty that he was living in, which is perhaps why he created this world of escapism. Now, another thing we learn about James Gatz is his attitude to women, and this might be quite surprising to you, considering the sort of highly romantic view of Daisy that J. Gatsby seems to have. Well, James Gatz had certainly a different outlook on women. It says he knew women early. That is a euphemism. That means that he was having sex with women from a very early age. And since they spoiled him, so because women found him attractive, it doesn't mean like with gifts, it just means that women found him attractive and sort of lavished attention on him, he became contemptuous of them, of young virgins because they were ignorant, of the others because they were hysterical about things which in his overwhelming self-absorption he took for granted. So this tells us that Gatsby is sleeping with two types of women, the inexperienced and the experienced. He doesn't like the virgins because they don't know what they're doing. Yeah, that's what it means by ignorant, as in don't know what they're doing in bed. But the others, the ones who do know what they're doing in bed, he doesn't like them either. Look at how scornful they were hysterical about things. Note that vague language that he took for granted. So the inexperienced he doesn't like because they're inexperienced. The experienced he doesn't like because, well, they're experienced to worry about things. So what are they hysterical about? Getting pregnant, for example, having their lives ruined by the fact that their reputations are tarnished. But James Gatz looks at both of those women, neither make him happy, and sees nothing but irritation. James Gatz is not the greatest guy. But his heart was in a constant turbulent riot. The most grotesque and fantastic conceits haunted him in his bed at night. Now, this bit is really showing us the sort of strange, like, torment that he felt in these moments. The idea of grotesque and fantastic conceits haunting him, this metaphor of something that feels almost like a nightmare. A universe of ineffable gaudiness spun itself out inside his brain while the clock ticked on the washstand. So actually his nightmares are so vivid and colourful and brash, but it's taunting him because it's all of the things that he can't have. This is a young man obsessed with materialism and conspicuous consumption, but because he can't have them. Each night he added to the pattern of his fancies until drowsiness closed down upon some vivid scene with an oblivious embrace. And this is the idea that he is constantly adding to his fantasy. It's not one solid dream that remains constant. Whenever he thinks of something else new that would be good for this kind of idea, he adds to it. Now that's really important because the same thing later on we can possibly apply to his view of Daisy too. And then we find out a little bit about his time with Dan Cody. So Dan Cody did actually intend on leaving him some money, so for the time a pretty sizable amount of money, $25,000, but because of the interventions of Ella Kay, who is the woman that got Dan Cody's money, he is simply the vague contour of J. Gatsby filling out to the substantiality of a man. So this basically means that you've got this, if you think about the concept of the identity of this J. Gatsby, this true version or the truest form of James Gatz, he's got the contour, he's got the sort of education, but he's got nothing to back him. So we can start to understand here some of J. Gatsby's insecurities about where he came from and the validity of this identity that he has constructed. And that is demonstrated to us so clearly in the next part of the chapter where we see him interacting with Tom. So in this moment where Tom and his friend Sloane, and Sloane's, we assume, wife, stop in on the house, you know, in order to have a little refreshment, there is a very, very clear class differentiation between them in their old money and Gatsby with his new money. And one of the ways that this is presented is through the juxtaposition between horses and cars. They all come on horseback. J. Gatsby has to admit that he hasn't got a horse, that although he used to ride in the army, he never bought one, and instead he'll have to follow you in his car, the car which is a sort of symbol of innovation and newness, hence his new money. There's a reason why J. Gatsby is kind of tied to the concept of the car, the yellow car. It's this position or kind of symbol of his wealth. And when he goes off to get his coat, there is this very awkward conversation between Tom, Sloane and the woman are kind of whispering, but between Tom and Nick, where Tom says, "My God, I believe the man's coming. Doesn't he know she doesn't want him?" And then he relates this to Daisy. "I wonder where in the devil he met Daisy. By God, I may be old-fashioned in my ideas, but women run around too much these days to suit me. They meet all kinds of crazy fish." That is all J. Gatsby is to Tom Buchanan, a crazy fish. He looks at the showiness of this new house bought with this new money that's suspicious, and he sees him as nothing more than an oddball, someone that he doesn't really want his wife associating with, someone that, you know, a person of true class wouldn't really want to have round for dinner. He is a sort of something to be amused by, but he's not someone that they would want in their lives. You get this massive class distinction. And J. Gatsby doesn't seem to have these cues down. He doesn't seem to be aware of the etiquette. And so, you know, Tom and his friends disappear just as Gatsby, with hat and light overcoat in hand, come out for the front door. And so there's a sort of sense of him being abandoned in this moment, assuming that they would want to accept him. And this is really what Jay Gatsby wants. He wants acceptance into a fold, into a group of people that he's never going to be able to reach. But this meeting does, like I said before, it does give Tom some concern, which is one of the reasons why he decides to go to the party with Daisy. Now, this is Nick's recollection, so you get the idea that Nick is reevaluating as much as Gatsby is, as he sees the party through Daisy's eyes. He says, "I felt an unpleasantness in the air, a pervading harshness that hadn't been there before. Or perhaps I'd merely grown used to it, grown to accept West Egg as a world complete in itself, with its own standards and its own great figures, second to nothing because it had no consciousness of being so. And now I was looking at it again through Daisy's eyes." So there's this sense of judgment again. And I know that Nick is the person who supposedly doesn't judge, but here he is thoroughly doing it. But there's almost a sort of sense that he feels judged for having enjoyed it and not seen it as Daisy and Tom would. And he says, you know, "It is invariably saddening to look through new eyes at things upon which you have expended your own powers of adjustment." So he's sort of conceding that he's got used to a certain way that perhaps he shouldn't have, that it's not acceptable. So he's looking at it with new eyes, Gatsby's looking at it with new eyes, and it's all because of Daisy's disapproval. But it does give Gatsby rather a good opportunity to establish a little bit of a power play between him and Tom Buchanan. You know, when Tom came to his house before for this refreshment, Gatsby was left on the back foot, and now he's in his kind of comfort zone. So look at how he introduces Tom to the people at his party. "Mrs. Buchanan and Mr. Buchanan." After an instant's hesitation, he added, "the polo player." "Oh no," objected Tom quickly. "Not me." But evidently the sound of it pleased Gatsby, for Tom remained the polo player for the rest of the evening. Now he does that for one reason and one reason alone. It makes Tom sound like new money. It makes it sound like he is known for sporting accomplishments and nothing more. That the name Buchanan isn't enough, that people wouldn't know who he is. So this is about undermining Tom's sense of class and status. It is a power play. And with that, Daisy seems to gain confidence as well, perhaps boosted by the fact that she is there with her lover, and she has this feeling that maybe in some way she has a power play here as well. She is the one that is used to being cheated on, and now she has this sort of confidence in having Gatsby with her. Look at the way that she scorns Tom and Tom's adulterous behaviour at this party. We've already heard earlier in the chapter that Tom is sort of seeking an oblivion at this party, and Daisy knows exactly what that means. "Go ahead," answered Daisy genially, that adverb of manner suggesting it's all a bit of a joke. "And if you want to take down any addresses, here's my little gold pencil." So she's basically saying, I know you're going to be meeting women. Go on, take my pen. Make it easier for yourself. So there is a confidence that she has here to call him out. I mean, it's very ironic because she is obviously conducting her own affair at the same time, but her first, we assume. And then we recognise that she knows exactly who it is that Tom is courting, telling Nick that the girl was common but pretty. And Nick realises that she's not having a good time, with the exception of when she is with Gatsby. So she's thrown into a kind of a party with a lot of people that she sort of doesn't really approve of, behaving in ways that she doesn't approve of, and has to put up with the fact that her husband is probably making arrangements with other women all around the party. And then by the end of the party, Nick considers just how much she disapproves. He says the rest offended her, and inarguably because it wasn't a gesture, but an emotion. She was appalled by West Egg, this unprecedented place that Broadway had begotten upon a Long Island fishing village, appalled by its raw vigour that chafed under the old euphemisms, and by the too obtrusive fate that herded its inhabitants along a shortcut from nothing to nothing. She saw something awful in the very simplicity she failed to understand. So it's quite difficult to unpick. There's one of the reasons that she's so offended by it is that she doesn't understand it. She doesn't understand how a place that used to be a fishing village has been built up. Now, of course, that's full of irony because everywhere began that way, including East Egg. It's not like palaces just appeared out of nowhere on East Egg. But it's the fact that it's Broadway that has moved in. So it's about celebrity, it's about fashion, it's about newness, okay? And when it says inarguably because it wasn't a gesture but an emotion, what that really means is that it's not a flyaway thought or comment. It's something that sort of is deep rooted. It's an emotion. It's not just a gesture. It's something that she feels right from deep inside. And all of this kind of behavior that she's seeing, it makes her feel uncomfortable. Look at this, look at these vocab choices. It's raw vigor. Look at the adjective raw. Look at the verb chafed. It's all about discomfort. And then there is this incredible snootiness about herding its inhabitant along a shortcut from nothing to nothing. This is about the idea that new money isn't going to last. Yeah, that if you start from nothing and you make your money quickly, you'll spend it just as quickly and you'll end up with nothing. It's quite an old money view of new money. So Gatsby, whilst Daisy is looking around and viewing all of these kind of different people and different behaviours that she feels so uncomfortable with, this kind of this drunkenness, Gatsby at the same time is also trying to impress her. And this moment is absolutely filled with symbolism. I've actually chosen two little sections that are separated out, but they're about the same characters. So when they first arrive, Gatsby points out this woman to Daisy, indicating a gorgeous, scarcely human orchid of a woman who sat in state under a white plum tree. And they sort of sit and stare at her. And Gatsby points out that the man bending over her is her director. So that in itself seems fairly straightforward. Obviously, there are celebrities, there are famous actresses that are very beautiful, and he's sort of showing off by saying, you know, here is this beautiful woman that you'd recognise. But the placement of actress and director is really, really interesting symbolically, particularly when you look at the later description of their behaviours. Here, almost the last thing I remember was standing with Daisy and watching the moving picture director and his star. Look at the way that star has been capitalised. They were still under the white plum tree, and their faces were touching except for a pale, thin ray of moonlight between. It occurred to me that he had been very slowly bending towards her all evening to attain this proximity, and even while I watched, I saw him stoop one ultimate degree and kiss at her cheek. If you look at these two characters in this light, you've got this perfect, beautiful woman who is staying still and motionless, having like almost with the idea that she's been directed as such. And then you've got the director getting closer and closer and closer, very slowly, moving towards the star, his star with a capital S. It's a symbol for Gatsby and Daisy. Daisy is that perfect still woman, almost a statue in Gatsby's mind. And he, for the last 5 years, has been moving closer and closer and closer. Look at how romanticized it is. You know, this idea of the moonlight, this thin ray of moonlight between them. This is how Gatsby views the relationship and the movement of the relationship and how special it is. But the irony is that this is happening in and amongst a party that is so full of sordid drunkenness, of women being dunked into pools because they won't stop screaming, of musicians crying as they sing, of fights breaking out, of women being chucked over their husband's shoulders. I know that that's an earlier description from a different chapter, but it's the same kinds of behaviours. And Gatsby is still kind of imagining this moment of beauty and perfection between him and Daisy. But by the end of the party, he too has realised that it hasn't gone his way and that she didn't like it. And it leads him to have this almost kind of crisis about their relationship, this thing that he has been focusing on for 5 years. He says, I feel far away from her. It's hard to make her understand. Nick misunderstands what he means here, and he thinks, oh, is he just talking about the dance? Is that what he means? But look at this. He dismissed all the dances he had given with a snap of the fingers. Daisy doesn't like something, it disappears. It no longer exists. Despite the fact that all of this money and luxury and like the fame that has come from these parties have all been engineered to get her here. She doesn't like them, they're gone. But actually the reality is what Daisy doesn't understand is that view, that romantic ideal, you know, going back to that metaphor or that symbol of the director moving slowly towards the star who is still and almost waiting for him. He needs Daisy to be that girl, but unfortunately Daisy has been married in between, which is why he wanted nothing less, note that litotes there, he wanted nothing less of Daisy than she should go to Tom and say, I never loved you. He wants her to obliterate 4 years. Okay, note the emotive verb there. He doesn't just want her to leave Tom. He wants her to create a narrative where Tom barely exists, where their love was never real, where the only man she ever loved was Gatsby, and she doesn't understand. Note the symbolism here as he breaks off having this conversation with Nick and begins to walk up and down a desolate path. Nice little bit of personification. A desolate path of fruit rinds and discarded favours and crushed flowers. Okay, look at those adjectives. Desolate, discarded, crushed. These are all symbolic of this kind of this precarious, dangerous moment where the dream he imagines being crushed. It also reminds us of the party, because all of these things are party favours. They're all crushed. They're all discarded. And it's basically hinging on whether or not Daisy can obliterate the past. Nick recognises that he can't or shouldn't ask too much, because what he's really trying to do is repeat the past or freeze a moment, go back to a moment in the past, this moment where, you know, he's imagining that they could get married in Louisville from her house, just as if it was 5 years before. But Gatsby's delusion here and Gatsby's expectations of the concept of the dream and the concept of Daisy are too high. Can't repeat the past, he cried incredulously. Why, of course you can. He looked round him wildly, as if the past were lurking here in the shadow of his house, just out of reach of his hand. Makes you think of the dream, of the green light, at the end of the pier, you know, this idea at the end of the dock of him stretching out his hand. You know, is that green light Daisy? Is that green light the past? He's desperate to go back, but as we all know, that is not realistic. Another reminder, of course, that this dream is destined to fail. The end of the chapter delves back into the past, another reflection of the beginnings of Daisy and Gatsby. And this is quite a complex moment that calls into question some of Gatsby's motivations. So look at the way that this section of the story begins with an ellipsis and one autumn night. It's quite reminiscent of Jordan's narrative as well, that started with a one day. It's that fairy tale style that again suggests that we're going to get a sort of romanticized version. So this is 5 years before. It's almost like the point that he's getting back to. They'd been walking down the street when the leaves were falling, and the sidewalk was white with moonlight. So this is in autumn. It's a cooler time, so it's not a kind of passionate sort of hot summer month. So it's a little bit cooler, it's a little bit calmer, but it is romantic, the sidewalk being white with moonlight. It was a cool night with that mysterious excitement in it which comes at the 2 changes of the year. So notice this idea about shifting, times changing. The quiet lights in the house were humming out into the darkness, and there was a stir and bustle among the stars. Note the onomatopoeia and this sort of rustling, sibilant sound, suggesting that the stars are almost talking about this moment. This moment is fated in some way. Out of the corner of his eye, Gatsby saw that the blocks of the sidewalks really formed a ladder and mounted to a secret place above the trees. He could climb to it, if he climbed alone, and once there, he could suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. Now, this is a biblical allusion to Jacob's ladder, the idea of climbing the ladder up to heaven. And in this moment, it's the sidewalk where he's walking with Daisy. So this path with Daisy is forming a ladder up to heaven amongst the trees. And what's up there? When he's up there, he can suck on the pap of life, gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder, i.e. he can get what he wants. But notice he's talking about climbing it alone. Yeah, this is about social climbing. This is about getting to the top. And so this is when he's sort of almost coming to a decision about how his life is going to be. And in this moment, he's obviously in this romantic moment with Daisy. You can tell his excitement, his heart beat faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. Note again that colour symbolism, this idea, this perfection, this ideal, this pure, this innocent girl. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So this is kind of bringing us back to the beginning of the chapter, the Platonic conception of himself, the concept of him as the Son of God with a mind that can create and build and build and build on who he wants to be. If he kisses her, he, note the personification, weds those visions, those ideas of his identity and who he is to her perishable breath. Perishable breath because she's tangible, she's real. So if he does this, it's a commitment to her that means that's what he's chosen, and he doesn't get to create more new exciting identities. So he waits, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star, like that he's waiting to be told that this is right, that this is fate. So it comes back to the idea of the stir and bustle among the stars. What a lovely romantic way to essentially describe social climbing through relationships. Then he kissed her. Look at that. Simple declarative sentence, no metaphor. Such juxtaposition to the highly metaphorical symbolic complexity of the sentences before. This is the moment of drama. Then he kissed her. It's the moment of transition. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. She blossomed for him like a flower. Note that simile. It's very, very typical of language used to describe Daisy, Daisy being a flower, in her name. But the fact that she blossoms for him like a flower opens up. This is the moment, perhaps, where Gatsby realizes what Daisy can do for him. I'm not trying to completely ruin the romance. I'm not suggesting that it's entirely money grabbing and that there's no real love, because I know that people do also want to see Gatsby as a romantic character. But this is about social mobility. We learn in this chapter that James Gats was deeply unhappy with being James Gats and created in his mind a perfect version of himself that would be Jay Gatsby, that would be as prominent in his mind as a sort of old money wealth. And here is a moment where he is able to consider that a relationship with someone like Daisy, old money, full of wealth, could get him to the top of that tree so that he could suck on the pap of life and gulp down the incomparable milk of wonder. Two metaphors that I do find a little bit queasy. But it's all about sort of taking, enjoying, consuming, which is what Gatsby wants. That's it from me. I hope that was helpful. There's so much in that chapter, so do feel free to go back and reread and make your own notes and have a little look. There is also a reading of this chapter. If you'd like to go back over it again now that you have listened to those notes, do just have a little look at my Gatsby audiobook playlist so that you can find chapter 6. If you haven't subscribed, please do so that you'll get notifications of when the next Gatsby videos are available, along with any other videos that are going to help you with your study of English literature or language. Any questions, just drop them to me in the comments and I will get back to you. That's it from me. Thank you so much for watching. Happy reading, happy revising.